Commissioner from Lincoln County, Oregon, and has been for lots of years before that. She was a radio personality, so anytime you tuned in to KMPT, it was Claire that you would hear. I've known Claire for 30 years. 28 of them, I knew her as Bill. So she's gone through a gender journey, and she's here to tell us about her transition. So with that, Claire, I'll let you take it, and I think you'll be sharing a screen, and you should be able to do that without a problem.
Okay, here we go. I've been Zooming for a while, but this is the very first meeting where I get to screen share. So please, everybody, be patient. Let's see, I think we've got it. Okay, well, Chris, thanks for the invitation. Thanks for the great introduction. I do have a few slides here, including, yes, you'll get to see a baby picture of little old me. I am certainly happy if the interest is there and if time permits to answer any questions. And just as a disclaimer, I will say I've never run into a question yet that I have been unwilling, unable, uncomfortable to answer. So this is your chance. So what do I want to do today? Just give you maybe a very brief history of modern transgender identity, give you a few highlights of my own journey, but I think the big important disclaimer is I don't want anybody to say, oh, I listened to Claire, that's what being transgender is all about. But just like every other human being, I think the journey of each transgender person is different. And again, remember, I'm not a medical or psychological expert. I'm talking about my own story and what I've been able to learn from the stories of others. So let me start off by asking you a question. Was there ever, and just answer it in your own mind, was there ever a time in your childhood when you said, gee, am I really a boy or a girl? Maybe everybody tells me I'm a boy, but I'm really a girl. And if that didn't happen to you, you were lucky enough to essentially feel yourself comfortable that your mind and your body matched right from the start. That wasn't me. I have had and have gender dysphoria. So I've got two definitions up here. The first one is essentially the dictionary definition, the condition of feeling one's emotional and psychological identity as male or female to be opposite of one's biological sex. Another way of putting it, the mind and the body parts don't match. But the best description I ever have heard, this young woman, her name is Sarah McBride. She made her gender transition at age 20. In 2016, she became the first transgender person ever to speak at a national political convention. And when I heard her utter these words in a TED Talk, I said, yes, yes, exactly that. It's like a homesickness in your own body that never goes away. So really the feeling of your mind, your body, your spirit not matching up, it's been around for centuries, and that goes way beyond the scope of my talk. But for instance, if you've heard about the Native American, the two-spirit tradition in many tribes, you look at a lot of cultures around the world, and you'll find that this very rigid male-female identity is perhaps been the norm in I would say, European, North American culture for the past few hundred years, but not everywhere. So modern science really began looking at this, I would say, in the 1930s. This is Dr. Harry Benjamin and his most famous work on the subject. He was active in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and, again, words that really struck with me reading some of his stuff. He said, never, ever did he see someone cured of transsexuality or gender dysphoria through therapy. the only thing that brought relief, hormones and surgery. And he predicted in the 1960s that someday a medical basis would be found for this condition. And now that is starting to happen, that there have been interesting post-mortem brain studies, brain scans of living transgender people, genetic studies that are all pointing towards a physical basis for being transgender. You know, we all start out female in the womb, and then the differentiation begins to happen about at the 6-week mark. And for whatever reason, you know, the growing theory, it's not scientific consensus yet, but the growing theory is something happens at that point that puts people on a different path. So here's that baby picture I promised you, and boy, I don't know, I look at that now, maybe I'm just projecting, but I think that little guy, he looks a little maybe thoughtful, but kind of maybe a little confused, like wondering, something's not right here, but I don't know what it was. But I'll tell you, by age 5, when I first went off to kindergarten, I knew something was different. I really don't think I could articulate it then. I just really didn't I didn't fit in with the boys at all. I felt a lot closer to the girls. The few friends I made were all girls. But then by the age 10, I can distinctly remember going to bed every night, even though I said, well, gee, God is not, in fact, a wish-granting fairy, but I'd go to bed every night for years, praying that I'd wake up a girl. And then even by the time I was in my middle teens, you know, maybe age 15, 1975 or so, I learned that this just wasn't a fantasy, that in fact it was actually possible to medically and socially transition. But still, a lot of things stopped me, and often people will ask me, why did you wait so long? Well, first off, I convinced myself that I wouldn't be accepted by my family, by the public. You know, there's medical gatekeeping, and the medical profession really, then and now, I think, has to make a decision, you know, with a lot of conditions, how best to allocate limited resources. And back in the 1960s and 70s, there was this great emphasis on finding people who could essentially blend or disappear into their new identity, physically, you know, in every other aspect. And you look at me, I hope you see a woman, but you also see a woman who's 6 feet tall, naturally broad shoulders, some male features, but I hope it doesn't matter to you. And then again, even in the 70s, as a youth, I grew up in Portland, a very visible gay community, but there was no trans community. I had heard of a few prominent trans people, but they were nowhere in my orbit, and nobody I could turn to for information. So I really felt like I would be almost journeying forward blind. And frankly, the expense was kind of daunting because, you know, nowadays more and more insurance plans are recognizing this as a medical necessity transition, and at least funding some aspects of transition. But back in the 1980s, that didn't happen. So what about my parents? There they are, October 12th, 1951. They had just gotten married in downtown Portland. And if any of you are car buffs, that's a 1951 Kaiser that my dad had borrowed. And they were on their way to what was not yet Lincoln City, but was still Ocean Lake, the Dorchester house. And I have, you know, my dad died in 1991, my mother in 2002. And, you know, one of the blocks I put up in my mind was they never could have dealt with it. No, actually, I think they could have. My dad was, you know, a star athlete in high school. He fought in the Pacific in World War II, came home with 5 Purple Hearts, but he was never a great Santini type. I was always the intellectual kid, the one who brought home the good grades and the scholarships and the speech awards. And he was always so exceptionally proud of me. And my mother was too. I think she would have been the type for a day or two, would have been asking herself, oh my goodness, what did I do wrong? This is my fault, isn't it? But I really think now, you know, they would have loved and embraced me. And I'm sorry, you know, in a way that I never gave them a chance to get to know the real me. So what was the trigger finally? I had been married for about 11 years. And, you know, I think every marriage story, whether successful or not, is different. But we were together 11 years, and I've said, I think 5 years we're happy. The second half, nothing really cataclysmic. We just started drifting further and further apart. So when my wife left, I finally had that moment where the little voice in the back of my head that had never gone away in almost 58 years then said, okay, I'm still here. What are you waiting for? And this time I was able to reach out to a couple of friends. Bethany, who is actually a recent U of O journalism grad and is still active in Eugene. Her transition was about 4 years ago, and I know she's been prominent in the community. Donna, I knew and worked with at a radio station in Portland more than 30 years ago. We've kept in touch all these years, and I still remember that night. She and her partner lived near Mount Hood, and I just sent her a Facebook message one night and said, Donna, would you be available for a phone chat soon? And she said, yeah, how about Wednesday or Thursday after 7? And I said, great, thank you. And she said she closed her laptop, turned to her partner and said, Bill Hall is going to transition. And I said, what? When she told me that story, she said, I just knew. So one of the first things, as I looked around for really a blueprint on how to do this, they say, find a good therapist who specializes in gender issues. And I did, and I had my first session with her in December of 2017, and it was a great working relationship. And I like a therapist who doesn't lead you to conclusions, well, other than helping you find your own conclusions. But at the end of our first hour together, I said to her, well, doctor, what do you think? And this is what she said. I think you know what you want to do and what you need to do. And I see my role as providing emotional support and resources. And oh my God, think, you know, the way I can describe that feeling at that moment was like a 1,000-pound weight that I had been carrying around for 50 years was lifted. So that sent me on the path toward, you know, actually making it happen. Another big date was the beginning of hormone replacement therapy, essentially somebody making the kind of journey I am. It began with this little blue pill, estradiol, added a testosterone blocker, and they want you to build this to build up gradually in your body. So now I'm taking a weekly shot of estradiol, and things are moving along slowly, steadily, gradually. But I had targeted the first weekend in June of 2018 as the point of actually going public. And oh, what an amazing weekend that was, and one that I'm going to remember for the rest of my life. I had approached a friend who freelances for the Oregonian to see if I thought it might be newsworthy. Well, you know, the fact that I am a local elected official transitioning on the job, and that really doesn't happen very often. And they did a remarkable story that got great front page play. I've got so many calls, Facebook messages, emails. People even took the time to go and buy old-fashioned congratulatory cards, and I treasure those. But here is the single set of messages, of images from that weekend that mean the most to me. That is Ella. Ella is 11 years old, or was 11 years old at the time. So yeah, she'd be 13 now. And that is Ella with her mom, Joy. And I had not met Ella yet, but I had been connected with Joy a few weeks earlier by a mutual friend. And, you know, like most people, she said, we stopped getting the print paper years ago, but we had to have a print version of this. So they got in their car and drove to like 3 convenience stores before they finally found it. And they took these pictures and they sent them to me. And yeah, it still really gets to me. And when I finally got to meet Ella in person about a week later, I just became a mess. I burst into tears, and her mom thought that, you know, told me she thought she had upset me. And I came back over to her and I said, no, I'm just so overwhelmed. I'm so happy that you get to be who you were meant to be so young. And I'll admit, I was thinking about, you know, how could my life have been different if I had had the opportunity to be me right from the start. But if by me making this journey and being public about it, it makes things a little more easy, promotes a little more outstanding for Ella and the young people who come after her, then I think I've been given a very precious gift to share. A couple of my presentations I've done have been about have been specifically aimed at workplaces, and people often ask me, well, what can you do if you have a coworker who comes out as trans? And basically, I think it comes down to treating them decently, being supportive of them. Don't expect them all to be like me and willing and able to talk about it all the time. You know, and even when the person isn't around, stand up for them. Don't, you know, just don't shrug it off if somebody makes a cruel remark or other kind of, or joke. So because of my really privileged position, I have had a lot of opportunities even before this day to share my story. I was in the Portland Pride Parade that same June. Basic Rights Oregon has done a series of programs called the Coming Out Monologues, where they gather a group of LGBTQ people on stage just to tell their stories. And that was in Portland a couple of years ago, a crowd of several hundred people. And then, yeah, that is Caitlyn Jenner with me. She was in Eugene, actually speaking to an audience of several hundred graduate journalism students in June of 2018. And my friend Bethany, who you saw earlier in the programs, you know, was responsible for that happening. And she said, you wouldn't want to meet Caitlyn Jenner, would you? And I said, oh, you've got to be kidding me. Well, you know, she is something of a controversial figure in the transgender community to some people because they feel like she doesn't represent the typical trans experience. Well, neither do I, but I really applaud her again for being public. As I was thinking about my own journey, I said, gee, essentially, I've got to do this on a stage in front of 50,000 people in Lincoln County, but she did it with the whole world watching. So bravo for her. You know, a lot of times people tell me the fact that I've done this, that I've done it in a public way, and that I've been out there, they say, oh, you're really so brave. And frankly, after 2 years, I really am still having trouble processing it. You know, again, it was my friend Bethany, we were talking about that, and she said, no, being brave is running into a burning building to save somebody's life. That this is what each of us had to do to, you know, not even so much for happiness, but just for true peace of mind. But if you live your truth honestly, openly, and publicly in a world where there is a significant, but I hope a minority of people who are hostile to it, then I'm going to say maybe that is brave. A couple of other political transgender people, that's Stu Rasmussen, the former mayor of Silverton, and the fact that you know, somebody was able to transition in a little farm valley town. That gave me hope. Danica Rome, she was elected to the Virginia State Legislature 2017, again, the first transgender state legislator. So, you know, on the plus side, it seems like barriers are falling all the time. Certainly, Caitlyn Jenner pushed the state of being transgender into the forefront, but you know, Laverne Cox on Orange is the New Black. But the last few years have also been really challenging for transgender people. A lot of states trying to push bathroom bills, you know, essentially that you could only use the bathroom of the gender you were assigned at birth. And I don't want to give up the ladies' room. I like the privacy. 98% of the time they're cleaner, bigger. So, you know, to me, anyway, I don't want to get too deeply into that, but the ban on transgender people in our military, but, you know, that's politics. But unfortunately, and that, depending on who's in charge, that comes and goes. But the long-term realities, which fortunately I haven't experienced, but if you go into the literature, you see suicide attempts, suicide completion, poverty, homelessness, job discrimination, and violence against transgender people is just off the charts. And so I look at myself again and my story. I find you know, there have been rocky steps along this road, but I just have to say I feel so blessed to wake up every morning as me. And I think that's the best way I can wrap up my story. And I thank you all for your time and attention. And Chris, if there's any opportunity for questions and anybody's got a burning question, I'm game. And if not, I'll say thank you.
Well, thank you, Claire. I have to say I went to Newport. Yes, thanks. I went to Newport and went to a chamber meeting. I used to be very active over there. And I asked who the program was, asked somebody before I went, and they said, oh, it's Claire Hall, County Commissioner. And I went, I don't know who that is. And I haven't even told you this, Claire. And then when I got to the chamber lunch and I got my lunch and I'm sitting at my table, I see this woman over there that's a larger woman. I didn't know who it was. Mm-hmm. And then when you got up to speak as Claire Hall, I still didn't know who you were until you opened your mouth. And I went, I know you. And after your program, I went up and gave you a big hug.
Yes.
And you said something like, I hadn't changed a bit. And we both said, you said, and well, I have. And I said, well, you have. Anyway, Claire looked so happy that I am just delighted for you, Claire, that you were brave enough to go through that such a public way. But when I was around town afterwards, later that weekend, I would say that I went to chamber and I saw Claire Hall speak. And most people were just like, yeah, Claire Hall. A couple people said, yeah, that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Very accepting. And so I think that the fear of non-acceptance in the most part is just that. It's a fear. Yes. And not the reality. Yes, there are the people that can't handle you using the wrong restroom and they're going to go beat somebody up like happened in Lincoln County. And that was so unfortunate. But anyway, I just had to tell that story. Anyone have any questions of Claire? Anita, you have to unmute yourself.
No, and I'll eventually take down that hand. So Claire, that was very interesting. I found it, you know, it was really good from that you followed yourself from start to where you are now. You talked about a girl, I think you said her name is Ella and she was 11.
Yes.
But can you fill in the pieces? I don't know anything about her. Was she born, I mean, previously she had been identified as a boy, I'm guessing?
Yes, identified as male at birth, but Joy said that, I'm trying to remember, there was age 2, 3 at the latest. She actually went to her parents and said, Mommy, Daddy, you know, I'm really not a boy. I'm actually a girl. And, you know, it was a surprise to them. I think this is more common than people realize, but it's still uncommon enough. For the average parent, it's a big surprise, but they did some investigation. They had some individual and family counseling, and you know, Ella wasn't ready to begin living as a girl yet, but they basically came to a family agreement that as soon as that she would register at school as a girl, begin presenting as a girl. And Joy said it was the most wonderful and remarkable transformation, that she left school one spring as a lonely, shy, and mostly angry. She said the male version of Ella was very angry, and here is this happy, outgoing, friendly, energetic girl, the person she was always meant to be. So she has been living as a girl ever since.
Did she have a surgical procedure? Is she currently taking hormones? I mean, what happens when you're that young?
Yeah, let me go into this. I think it's good because in the culture wars, this is something that's actively debated, and our children being allowed to, or in some of the more sinister interpretations, being forced into irreversible changes. They are not. That, you know, for an elementary student, pre-adolescent, it's strictly what they call social transition: name, hair, clothing. Now, what can happen right at the time of puberty, they have drugs essentially that are puberty blockers. And say if I had had puberty blockers when I was 12 or 13, then I probably wouldn't have been 6 feet tall. I wouldn't have had the broad shoulders. I wouldn't have ended up with the naturally deep voice. But, you know, then say if a couple, 3 years later, I'd said, well, gee, no, this is a mistake. I could have worked with my parents and the doctor to stop the puberty blockers, and then had what is pretty much a normal but delayed puberty. And the actual hormone therapy usually doesn't begin until late teens at the soonest. And I think I've read of maybe 1, 2 exceptions, but surgery doesn't happen before the age of 18 at the soonest. Thanks.
Other questions? Nick?
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Claire, for speaking. Amazing. I'm happy for you. And
thank you.
I was wondering, how long does hormone therapy last? Do you have to do it? I don't know. I guess I should end my question there.
No, no, I know what you're asking. Yeah, it's something I will have to be on hormone replacement therapy for the rest of my life. It's, you know, the body doesn't naturally manufacture, you know, or for somebody going the other way, it just does not manufacture estrogen or testosterone at the levels that if you were genetically male or female at birth.
Absolutely. My nephew right now is going through a transition, and just the amount of criticism online that he's getting on a daily basis is kind of frustrating.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, and they're doing great at it. In defense of it, do you have any suggestions on who to talk to by chance?
Well, it depends on the size of the community, but a lot of places do have support organizations or networks. I mean, even right here in Lincoln County, which isn't all that big, we've had, I think it's about a dozen years old now, a chapter of PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, which really started out specifically to support parents of school-aged kids who were in the LGBTQ community. But it's expanded to where it's now more kind of just a general support group, not only for family members, but for people in the community themselves. And we've got a pretty good network. I mean, sometimes people, you know, parents of a child on the verge of this journey, I've sat down and talked to a couple of them. They've also been able to provide referrals to healthcare providers. And again, that's a challenge in a rural area. I mean, I get my hormone therapy, and I consider myself relatively lucky to not have to go all that far, in Alsea, the rural health clinic in Alsea. But it turned out there was a nurse practitioner there who has training in managing hormone replacement therapy, and I've been working with her for more than 2.5 years now. It's wonderful. There was a doctor in Corvallis, which, you know, would have been nice and handy for me, but she was booked out for like 4 months. And I kind of said, oh my God, I waited all my life for this and 4 more months. But luckily I was able to see that provider the next week, and, you know, it just all came together.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Claire.
Thank
I hope
you.
you have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, I have a question. Claire, I recorded this in case you want to see this later. I'll be sending it out to everyone
Okay.
on YouTube. I loved your presentation. It was very educational, and it's just really awesome. My question is, I like your name too. So how did you choose your name?
Okay. And every transgender person has a different story on that. In my case, would you believe I picked it out of a comic book?
Yes, I believe that.
I was 10 years old, and I loved comic books, especially the whole DC comics, you know, Superman, Wonder Woman, Batman, Green Lantern. And there was this story about Superman as a teenager. He has an encounter with an alien woman. He says some not uncomplimentary things about the ability, her ability to drive her spacecraft. So she teaches him a lesson, and boom, he's a girl. And so at home they say, well, we've got to have a new identity for you. How about if you're Claire Kent? And I cannot even explain it why to this day, but I fell in love with that name instantaneously. And I told myself, I'm going to be Claire someday. And, you know, I think it's a beautiful feminine name. It's not all that common, but yet it's not so uncommon that people say, huh? And then I think it was when I was a teen, you know, I said, well, what does this name I've adopted mean? And when I looked and I saw clear, bright, I said, yeah, it's just perfect. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I do have one more question.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, but we got to cut it off.
I'm the last one.
Quick.
Okay, it's 1 o'clock. I was just wondering, and thank you very much, Claire. You're an amazing person.
Thank you.
I know that the journey has been difficult for you, and I've talked to other people who don't seem that they've been able to adjust as well as you have. What do you attribute your positive outlook? And I mean, I've talked to people who are very lonely. They don't have a supportive community. They feel like they're still in the middle of something that they don't understand.
Yeah, it can be exceptionally lonely because, you know, like on Facebook, I'm probably friends with several hundred transgender people, mostly transgender women around the country. And, you know, my family by marriage abandoned me, but my birth family did not. The people I care about in this community did not, you know, so again, I just keep reminding myself of my privilege and that I'm in a place, and I think the fact that people had known me here for 30 years and kind of said, well, gee, she seems, I don't know, stable. If I don't get this, you know, the reactions, a whole big segment of people saying, you know, wow, this is wonderful. I'm so truly happy for you. The hugs and high fives, and that was great. But even the number who kind of would say, well, I really don't get this, but if you're happy and you keep doing the job we elected you for, fine by me. So, yeah, it is hard to reach out and make friends if you're in a situation. And I think it is, in a situation like this, it's very common, I think, to feel exceptionally self-conscious. People are looking at you. I don't know, one day my therapist said, I complained about that to my therapist, and she said, well, hey, you're 6 feet tall. people often stare at tall women whether they know they were born women or not. And I said, well, yeah, that's true too. So it takes a tremendous amount of self-confidence, support. And, you know, again, that's where I said in the ending, I'm blessed, I'm lucky. I've got privileges that the average person on this journey hasn't had. So.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Claire might be willing to stay after. I do want to wrap up the meeting though for those that have to go.